There's a story many still whisper about. The year was 1947. A massive healing tent stood filled beyond capacity, thousands gathered, pressed shoulder to shoulder, desperate for a hope. The air was thick with expectation. Then suddenly, something unusual happened. The power went out. Darkness swallowed the entire tent. But instead of panic, something else filled the atmosphere. People began to pray. And then, according to witnesses, the presence of God became so overwhelming that it felt like the tent itself could not contain it, like something invisible had exploded in the spirit. Cries turned into testimonies, pain turned into relief, and right there in the darkness, miracles began to happen. That night would go on to define the ministry of Oral Roberts, not just as a preacher, but as a man who carried something beyond explanation. But what most people don't know is this: that kind of power came with a price, a hidden cost, a life of sacrifice few ever saw. In today's video, we uncover the untold story of Oral Roberts, the price he paid for the anointing, and the battles behind the miracles. If you're ready to see what it truly costs to carry divine power, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who needs to understand the deeper side of calling. Now, let's step into the story. There are moments in history when a man's life stops being his own. Moments when destiny interrupts comfort, when purpose overrides plans, when heaven places a demand so heavy, it reshapes everything. For Oral Roberts, that moment did not come with applause. It came with pain, it came with weakness, and it came with a question that would define the rest of his life. What are you going to do with what I have given you? Oral Roberts was not born into power. He was not raised in influence. He did not begin as a man people would gather to hear. In fact, his early life looked like the exact opposite of someone destined for global impact. Born in rural Oklahoma in 1918, he grew up in a modest home shaped by faith, struggle, and survival. His father was a Pentecostal preacher, but ministry in those days did not come with wealth or recognition. It came with long roads, little money, and constant sacrifice. Young Oral watched it all. The prayers, the hardships, the unseen battles. But even then, something deeper was forming in him. Not ambition, not fame, but a sensitivity to the things of God. Then came the moment that would nearly end his life. At the age of 17, Oral Roberts was diagnosed with tuberculosis, a disease that, at the time, carried what felt like a death sentence. His body began to fail. Strength disappeared. Breath became a struggle, and slowly, the reality settled in. He was dying. There is something about facing death early that changes a person. It strips away illusion. It forces clarity. And for Oral Roberts, it became the place where everything shifted. He was bedridden, weak, helpless, but in that fragile state, something began to stir, not in his body, but in his spirit, a hunger, a cry, a desperate reaching for something beyond medicine. His family, rooted in faith, refused to surrender to the diagnosis. They believed in healing. They believed God still moved. And so, in what seemed like a last attempt, they took him to a healing meeting led by evangelist George Mancy. That night would become legendary, not because of spectacle, but because of what happened in the unseen. As Oral Roberts sat in that service, frail, exhausted, barely holding on, something began to rise within him. Hope, faith, expectation. And when hands were laid on him in prayer, everything changed. The sickness that had gripped his body broke. The weakness that had confined him lifted. The boy who was dying stood up healed. But healing was only the beginning, because what happened next would define the course of his calling. After his miraculous recovery, Oral Roberts made a vow, a private promise, one that many never fully understood. He said, "God, if you will heal me, I will take your healing power to my generation." It sounded simple, but it was anything but, because that vow would require everything. At first, it didn't look like much. He began preaching in small churches, rural settings, unnoticed gatherings, places where no cameras existed, where no crowds gathered, where no one was watching. But something was different about him. It wasn't just his message, It was the weight behind it, the conviction, the authority, the undeniable sense that he had encountered something real. And slowly, people began to notice, not because he sought attention, but because power follows obedience. Then came the next shift. Oral Roberts began to step into something that, at the time, was controversial, risky, and even criticized. He started praying for the sick publicly. Now, in today's world, that may sound normal, but back then, it was not widely accepted. It invited scrutiny, doubt, and even opposition from within the church. But Oral Roberts did not move based on acceptance. He moved based on assignment. And so, in tent meetings across America, he began to do what he had promised God he would do. He prayed, he believed, and people began to experience something undeniable. The sick were healed, the broken were restored, the impossible became possible. But here's what many people don't see. Every visible miracle was backed by invisible cost, because as the crowds grew, so did the pressure. As testimonies increased, so did the criticism. As influence expanded, so did the weight of expectation. People saw the miracles, but they didn't see the nights of prayer. They saw the results, but they didn't see the battles. And this is where the story begins to shift, because the anointing that draws crowds also demands consecration. Oral Roberts was no longer just a preacher. He had become a vessel, a carrier of something that required constant surrender. And with that came a new reality. He could no longer live casually. Every decision mattered. Every step carried weight. Every moment required sensitivity. Because when a man carries power, he also carries responsibility. And this is where many misunderstand the cost of anointing. They see the platform, but not the pruning. They admire the influence, but ignore the isolation. For Oral Roberts, the journey was no longer about survival. It was about stewardship. God had given him something rare, something powerful, something that could not be treated lightly. And so, the question was no longer, can you preach? It became, can you carry what I've placed on your life? Because the truth is, the higher the calling, the deeper the cost. And Oral Roberts was about to learn that in ways he never imagined. The miracles would grow, the crowds would multiply, the influence would expand beyond anything he could have planned. But so would the sacrifice, so would the pressure, and so would the unseen battles that come with being chosen. Because the anointing does not just elevate a man, it tests him, it stretches him, it demands things from him that comfort never will. And as Oral Roberts stepped further into his calling, he was about to face a reality that many are not prepared for. The price of being used by God is not paid in public. It is paid in private. And what he would encounter next would push him beyond faith into something deeper, something costly, something that would prove whether his vow was just words or a life fully surrendered. Because calling may begin with an encounter, but it is sustained by sacrifice. And in the next chapter of his life, Oral Roberts would discover that the same power that lifted him would also demand everything from him. There is a stage in every calling that no one prepares you for. The stage where excitement fades, where novelty disappears, where what once felt like a privilege starts to feel like a weight. For Oral Roberts, this stage did not come suddenly. It crept in, quietly, gradually, almost unnoticed at first. The tents were getting bigger. The crowds were multiplying. What began as small gatherings in rural communities had now grown into massive healing crusades that stretched across cities. Thousands came, some desperate, some curious, some skeptical, but all watching. And with every meeting, expectations grew. People didn't just come to hear him preach anymore. They came expecting miracles. They came believing something would happen. They came placing their last hope on what he carried. And that is where the burden began. Because it is one thing to preach a message. It is another thing to carry people's expectations. Night after night, he stood before crowds filled with pain, blind eyes, crippled bodies, terminal diagnoses, stories that medicine had already given up on. And in those moments, there was no room for performance, no space for empty words. Because when someone is staring at you with their last hope, you cannot fake power. Oral Roberts understood this deeply, which is why his ministry was not built on charisma. It was built on conviction, but conviction comes at a cost, because the more he saw God move, the more people expected him to move again, and again, and again. There were no breaks, no pauses, no moments to step back and simply be human, because when you carry something rare, people will always demand more of it. And so, he kept going, from city to city, from meeting to meeting, from miracle to miracle. But behind the scenes, a different story was unfolding. The physical toll began to show: long nights, endless travel, constant giving. His body grew tired, but the schedule did not slow down. His mind grew heavy, but the expectations did not lessen. And this is where many begin to break. Not because they are weak, but because they are human. But for Oral Roberts, stopping was not an option, because he remembered the vow, the promise he made when he was dying, the commitment that came out of desperation, and now that promise was demanding to be fulfilled daily, relentlessly, completely. There is something about vows made in crisis. They sound simple in the moment, but they become weighty in fulfillment, because it is easy to say, "God, use me." It is harder to live a life where that prayer never turns off. And for Oral Roberts, the assignment had no off switch, but the pressure was not only physical, it was also spiritual, because as the miracles increased, so did the opposition. Critics began to rise. Voices began to question. Religious leaders, some of them began to push back. They doubted the healings. They challenged his methods. They accused him of emotional manipulation. And suddenly, the man who was helping thousands was also being scrutinized by thousands. This is the paradox of impact. The more lives you touch, the more opinions you attract. But criticism does something dangerous if not handled well. It can plant seeds of doubt, even in the most certain hearts. And so, Oral Roberts had to fight battles no one could see, not just against external voices, but against internal questions. Am I truly doing what God called me to do? Am I carrying this the right way? Can I sustain this pace? These were not questions he voiced publicly, but they were real, because the greater the calling, the more intense the refining. And then came another layer of pressure, the financial weight. Tent meetings were not cheap. Travel was not cheap. Organizing large gatherings required resources, and as the ministry grew, so did the cost of sustaining it. But here's the tension. He was not just leading a movement, he was responsible for keeping it alive. And this created a constant demand, not just for faith, but for provision. Every meeting required resources. Every expansion required risk. Every step forward demanded trust. And there were moments when the numbers didn't add up, moments when logic said, slow down, moments when practicality suggested retreat. But calling does not always align with comfort, and purpose does not always wait for convenience. So he kept moving, even when it stretched him, even when it scared him, even when it cost more than he expected, because deep down, he understood something many overlook. The anointing is not sustained by ease. It is sustained by obedience. But obedience is not always light. Sometimes, it feels like carrying something heavier than you were prepared for. And this is where the real test begins. Not when things are exciting, not when results are visible, but when the weight becomes real. For Oral Roberts, this was that season. The miracles continued, yes. The testimonies increased, absolutely. But internally, he was being stretched in ways no one could measure. Because every level of impact requires a deeper level of surrender. And surrender is not a one-time decision. It is a daily choice. To keep going, to keep believing, to keep showing up, even when everything within you is tired. And this is what many never see. They see the stage, but not the strain. They see the miracles, but not the maintenance. They see the influence, but not the inner battles. For Oral Roberts, the cost was no longer theoretical. It was real, daily, unavoidable. And yet, he continued, because something in him had already settled the question. This was not about comfort. It was not about approval. It was not even about success. It was about faithfulness. But faithfulness would soon demand even more, because the next phase of his journey would not just test his endurance, it would test his identity. It would force him to confront something deeper than pressure, something heavier than expectation. It would confront his heart, because there comes a point in every calling where God does not just ask, "Can you do the work?" He asks, "Can you handle what comes with it?" And for Oral Roberts, that question was about to become personal, because carrying power is one thing, but surviving what comes with it is another. And what happened next in his life would reveal a truth many are not ready for. Sometimes, the greatest battles are not external, they are internal. There is a dimension of calling that few people talk about, not because it is unknown, but because it is uncomfortable. It is the place where the battle is no longer around you, but within you. For Oral Roberts, this was the next phase of his journey, and it would become one of the most defining. By now, his name carried weight. Crowds gathered before he even arrived. Expectations followed him everywhere, and miracles real. Undeniable miracles continued to mark his ministry. From the outside, it looked like everything was working, everything was growing, everything was aligned. But inside, a different tension was building. Because success introduces something subtle, something dangerous, something that does not announce itself loudly. Familiarity, the same power that once left him in awe, was now becoming something he had to steward daily. And when something becomes familiar, it is easy to lose the reverence you once had for it. This is the hidden danger of sustained impact. At the beginning, everything feels sacred. Every moment feels significant. Every experience feels like a miracle. But over time, routine can replace wonder. Function can replace intimacy. Responsibility can replace relationship. And this is where many begin to drift, not outwardly, but inwardly. For Oral Roberts, this tension was real. He was still preaching, still praying for the sick, still seeing results. But deep within, there were moments where he could feel the difference. Moments where the fire didn't burn the same way. Moments where the weight of responsibility overshadowed the joy of connection. Moments where he had to ask himself, am I still doing this from the same place I started? This is not a question of failure. It is a question of alignment. Because it is possible to continue doing the work while slowly losing the heart behind it. And that is where the real war begins. Not a war of actions, but a war of motives. Why are you still showing up? Why are you still carrying this? Why are you still pushing forward? For recognition, for expectation, for obligation, or for God? These are the questions that do not appear on platforms, but they shape everything that happens on them. And for Oral Roberts, these questions became unavoidable, because the higher he went, the deeper the scrutiny, not just from others, but from within himself. There is a level of calling where you can no longer hide behind activity, where preaching more does not silence the questions, where doing more does not resolve the tension, where results do not replace authenticity. And this is where many face a silent crisis, because externally everything looks right, but internally something feels off. For Oral Roberts, this was not a moment of collapse, it was a moment of confrontation, a confrontation with his own heart. Because God does not just anoint a man for public impact, He also refines him for private alignment. And refinement is not comfortable. It exposes, it challenges, it strips away everything that is not rooted in truth. There were moments when he had to step away, not from the crowds, but from the noise within. Moments of solitude, moments of prayer, moments where he had to return to the very place where it all began. Not the tents, not the crowds, not the miracles, but the presence. Because at the core of everything, that was the source. And this is a truth many overlook. The anointing flows from intimacy, not activity, not visibility, not success, intimacy. And when that intimacy is threatened, everything else becomes fragile. So Oral Roberts made a decision to guard what mattered most. Not the ministry, not the reputation, not even the results, but the relationship. Because without that, everything else would eventually lose its meaning. This required discipline. The discipline to pause when the world demanded movement. the discipline to listen when noise surrounded him, the discipline to prioritize what was unseen over what was celebrated. And this is where the true cost of anointing becomes clear. It is not just about what you give publicly. It is about what you protect privately, because the same power that elevates a man can also expose him. And if the foundation is not strong, the weight will eventually reveal it. For Oral Roberts, this season became a turning point, not because anything collapsed, but because something deeper was established, a renewed clarity, a deeper surrender, a stronger alignment. He was no longer just moving with momentum. He was moving with intention, not just doing the work, but understanding the weight behind it. And this shifted everything, because now his ministry was no longer driven by expectation. It was anchored in conviction, and conviction has a different kind of strength. It is not shaken by opinions. It is not moved by pressure. It is rooted in something deeper than circumstance. But just as this internal alignment was being strengthened, another challenge was approaching, one that would not just test his heart, but his endurance in a way he had never experienced before. Because there is a stage in every calling where the battle is no longer about clarity. It is about resilience. How long can you carry this? How much can you endure? How far can you go without breaking? And for Oral Roberts, that test was closer than he realized, because what was coming next would push him beyond spiritual discipline into something far more intense, a level of pressure that would not just question his strength, but his capacity to keep going, because intimacy may sustain the anointing, but endurance sustains the assignment. And in the next chapter of his life, Oral Roberts would face a reality that many never survive. The weight of calling does not decrease with time. It increases. There is a difference between carrying a calling and being crushed by its weight. At first, the weight feels purposeful. It feels meaningful. It even feels empowering. But there comes a point when that same weight becomes personal. For Oral Roberts, this was not a sudden collapse. It was a gradual intensification. By now, his influence had reached extraordinary levels. Healing crusades had expanded across the nation. His name was no longer confined to tents. It had entered homes, television, global conversations. He had become one of the most recognized evangelists of his time. And with that level of visibility came something unavoidable, responsibility at a scale he had never imagined. Because now, it wasn't just about showing up to preach. It was about sustaining a movement. Organizations had formed, teams had grown, structures had been built, and at the center of it all was him. This is the hidden reality of influence. The higher you rise, the more people depend on you. Decisions were no longer simple. Every step carried consequences. Every choice affected not just him, but thousands connected to what he was building. And then came one of the most defining expansions of his life, the vision to build a university, not just any institution, but one that would merge faith and education, a place where spirituality and intellect would not compete, but collaborate. This vision became Oral Roberts University. At the time, it was bold, almost impossible. Some called it visionary, others called it unrealistic, because building a university was not just spiritual. It was financial, structural, operational. It required resources on a scale far beyond tent meetings. And yet, he moved forward, because calling does not always wait for confirmation. Sometimes, it demands action in uncertainty. Construction began, plans expanded, expectations increased, and with every step forward, the pressure multiplied, because now, the stakes were higher than ever. It was no longer just about healing the sick. It was about building something that would outlive him, something that would carry his vision into future generations. But building something lasting always comes with a price. The financial demands became intense, fundraising became constant, deadlines loomed, critics grew louder. And this is where the weight shifted. It was no longer just spiritual. It became deeply personal, because when a man pours his life into something, it becomes more than a project. It becomes part of him, and any threat to it feels like a threat to him. There were moments when the pressure felt overwhelming, moments when the gap between vision and resources seemed impossible to bridge. Moments when the question arose, did I go too far? This is the silent question many leaders face, not in public, but in private, when the weight becomes real, when the cost becomes visible, when the burden becomes undeniable. And yet, turning back was no longer an option, because vision, once embraced, does not easily release you. So he pressed on, through uncertainty, through criticism, through moments where logic said, this cannot work, because deep down, he believed something that defied reason. If God gave the vision, he would sustain it. But belief does not eliminate pressure, and faith does not remove the weight. It only gives you the strength to carry it. And sometimes, even that strength is tested, because alongside the external pressures, life itself began to happen. Personal challenges, family struggles, moments that had nothing to do with ministry, but everything to do with being human. And this is where the weight becomes unbearable for many, not when things are going wrong publicly, but when everything collides at once: calling, responsibility, expectation, and personal reality. For Oral Roberts, this convergence became one of the most intense seasons of his life, because now he was not just carrying a ministry, he was carrying a legacy. And legacy is heavy, because it forces you to think beyond yourself, beyond the moment, beyond the immediate. It demands sustainability, consistency, longevity, and those things require more than passion. They require endurance at a level few anticipate. There were days when the pressure was silent, but heavy, days when he had to show up strong publicly, while navigating weight privately, days when the expectations of others left no room for personal weakness. And this is where many misunderstand strength. They think strength means not feeling the weight, but real strength is carrying it anyway, even when it presses against you, even when it stretches you, even when it demands more than you feel capable of giving. For Oral Roberts, this was that reality. And yet, he continued, not because it was easy, not because it was comfortable, but because he understood something deeper than circumstance. Calling is not sustained by convenience, it is sustained by commitment. And commitment does not fluctuate with pressure, it remains. But here is the truth many are not prepared for. Even the strongest commitment can be tested, and sometimes the test does not come from outside. It comes from within the very thing you built, because the next phase of his journey would not just challenge his endurance, it would confront the very foundation of everything he had established. It would force him to face a reality that many never see coming, that sometimes the greatest pressure is not in starting something, it is in sustaining it. And for Oral Roberts, that moment was approaching, a moment that would stretch his faith beyond limits, a moment that would demand more than strength, a moment that would reveal whether everything he carried could truly endure, because building something for God is one thing, but trusting Him to sustain it is another. And what happened next would define not just his ministry, but his legacy forever. There is a final stage in every calling, a stage that is not defined by how it begins, or even how it grows, but by what remains when the man is no longer at the center of it. For Oral Roberts, this stage would not come easily, because everything he had built, everything he had carried, everything he had endured, was now approaching a defining question. Would it last? By this point, his life had already defied expectations. From a dying teenager healed of tuberculosis, to a global evangelist seen by millions, from small rural gatherings, to establishing Oral Roberts University, a symbol of faith and education intertwined. It was a life marked by undeniable impact, but impact alone does not define legacy, because legacy is not measured by what you build, it is measured by what continues after you. And this is where the true price of anointing reveals itself, not in the miracles, not in the crowds, not even in the achievements, but in the sustainability of what was started. As the years went on, the pressures did not disappear, they evolved. The ministry landscape changed, new voices emerged, new methods developed, and the world itself began to shift in ways no one could fully control. And suddenly, what once felt groundbreaking faced the challenge of remaining relevant. This is the tension every pioneer eventually faces. How do you carry something timeless in a world that is constantly changing? For Oral Roberts, this was not just theoretical, it was personal, because the structures he had built were now moving into a phase where they had to stand beyond him. Leadership transitions became necessary. Responsibility had to be shared, control had to be released. And that is one of the hardest prices to pay, not building something, but letting it go. Because when you have poured your life into something, releasing it feels like losing a part of yourself, but legacy demands it, because if something cannot survive beyond you, it was never truly built to last. And so, he began to step back, gradually, intentionally, not because he had nothing left to give, but because the next phase required something different. Trust that what had been built on obedience would be sustained by the same. But stepping back does not remove the weight, because even from a distance, the responsibility remains. There were challenges, moments when the institution faced difficulties, moments when leadership decisions were questioned, moments when the stability of what he built seemed uncertain. And in those moments, the question returned, was it worth it? Not in doubt of purpose, but in reflection of cost, because the price he paid was not small. It was years of relentless giving, years of unseen battles, years of carrying something that never allowed him to live casually. It was the sacrifice of comfort, the surrender of control, the constant demand to remain aligned with something greater than himself. And yet, when you look at his life as a whole, the answer becomes clear, because impact was never the end goal. Obedience was, and obedience, when sustained over a lifetime, leaves a mark that cannot be erased, even after the man is gone. When Oral Roberts eventually passed in 2009, it did not mark the end of his influence, because what he carried, what he built, what he established, had already extended beyond him. Lives had been changed, faith had been ignited. A generation had witnessed something that challenged their understanding of what was possible. And that is the true measure of a life poured out. Not how loudly it was celebrated, but how deeply it was felt. Because the greatest impact is not always visible in the moment. Sometimes it unfolds over time, in the lives of those who were touched, in the institutions that continue, in the seeds that were planted in places no one can fully track. For Oral Roberts, the price he paid for the anointing was real. It cost him ease. It cost him simplicity. It cost him a life that could have been quieter, more predictable, less demanding, but in exchange, he became part of something eternal. And that is the paradox of calling. You lose what is temporary. To gain what is lasting, you surrender what is comfortable. To step into what is meaningful, you give up control, to become part of a greater story. And that story does not end with you. It continues, long after the stage is empty, long after the crowds have gone, long after the voice that once spoke has gone silent. Because true anointing is not about the man, it is about the impact that outlives him. And that is the final lesson his life leaves behind. The price of being used by God is high, but the value of a life fully surrendered is immeasurable. So the question is not whether the anointing is powerful, it is. The question is, are you willing to pay the price to carry it? In the end, the life of Oral Roberts stands as more than a story of miracles. It is a testimony of surrender. He walked a path few would choose, carried a weight many would avoid, and remained faithful when the cost became real. Behind every healing was a hidden sacrifice. Behind every crowd was a private battle. Behind every breakthrough, a man who chose obedience over comfort. And that is the true legacy he leaves behind. Not just power, not just influence, but a life fully given. A reminder that the anointing is not cheap, and purpose is never casual. It demands everything, but what it produces echoes beyond a lifetime. If this story stirred something in you, don't just watch and move on. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, share it with someone, and drop a comment below what part of this story impacted you the most.